Very happy to see another full auditorium, just like we had a couple of weeks ago when Suresh was here. Anand Rajaraman is our distinguished alumnus. In fact, he received this distinguished alumnus award for 2013 today. So let's congratulate him on that. And we are very happy to have him here as our lecturer this evening. Anand is, by the way, another distinction that Anand has is this Alumni Leadership Lecture Series was actually inaugurated by him back in December 2011. I don't know how many of you remember that. How many of you attended his talk in December 2011? Anybody here? Okay. So you can repeat your talk if you want. So since it's a full room and it's getting late, without further ado, I'll invite Anand to address.
So when Professor Nagarajan invited me to give this talk, I didn't realize there was no overlap between the previous audience and this audience. Otherwise, I could have done the same talk and saved some time making slides. But so I didn't know that. So in the last couple of years, I've been both an entrepreneur and a venture capitalist and an academic over the last 3 years. And the area that I've been primarily working on is this space that's loosely called big data. Right? How many of you have heard of the term big data? Please raise your hand. So all of you know the term big data. What I'm going to try to, and there was, and as I worked through this big data space, I was, invited to give a talk recently on sort of tracing how the big data, the applications of data have evolved over the past, I'd say 20 years or so. And the interesting thing for me is that as I thought back to my own career over the last 20 years, I graduated from IIT Madras exactly 20 years ago, 1993, July. So it's been 20 years since I graduated. I was in the same place as you 20 years ago. And I was just, as I look back on my career and everything that I've done, everything has involved analyzing data in some form or the other. And the world and industry has gone through kind of a lot of change in the kinds of data sources that are available and the way that we analyze them and the way that we do interesting things with them. And I thought what would be interesting would be a talk that sort of goes down two parallel tracks at the same time, right? One is sort of tracing the evolution of these, what I call big data applications. And the other at the same time is also a walk down memory lane for me, because the applications that I'm going to use as examples to illustrate this evolution are applications that I had a hand in developing, right? One way or the other. So it will both be kind of a personal reminiscence for me, as well as something I hope is useful because it sort of illustrates the broad trajectory and history of the space as it has evolved. Right? So that's kind of the backdrop for this talk. Right? Now I wasn't sure about the audience. Clearly we have a large audience, but I wasn't sure exactly about the technical sophistication of the audience and where I should pitch it at. So if at any point if you have any questions or anything, just ask. I'm going to show you. So I don't know whether you know this data point, but Eric Schmidt is the chairman of Google, and he remarked on this, made this comment maybe 2 years ago, when he said that every 2 days today we take as much information as we did from the dawn of civilization until 2000. Right? This is a very stunning statement if you think about it. Right? I mean, think about the whole of human history from whatever point that you want to think about in the remote past, 2003, and think about all the books, all the manuscripts, everything, all the periodicals, all the journals, everything that has been written at that point. Right? And we create that much data every 2 days. Right? So, and if this data kind of represents the sum total, of human output, it's the sum total of human output is sort of increasing, and at some sort of tremendous trajectory. Now, I have no clue how Eric Schmidt figured this out or if it's even true, right? It could be false for all I know, but it's an interesting soundbite to start a talk with, which is why I put it there. So the interesting thing is we have all this data that's kind of increasing and this, and this is 2 years ago, so I imagine now we probably create, every day we probably create as much information as we created in all of the past history of the world every day, for instance, right? So there's some kind of exponential process that's going on here. So the amount of data in the world is sort of increasing, and it's probably increasing at a much faster rate than probably many other laws and laws that we are familiar with in the world. So when you have data that's sort of increasing at this rate, right? Human beings, being the kind of people we are, come up with ways of using this data. And what we do is we sort of create a new class of applications that I'll call data-driven applications that use data and do interesting things, right? And I sort of very simply define a data-driven application as an application that takes data and uses it in some useful and non-trivial kind of way to do something interesting, right? So that's what it's a very broad definition of what a data-driven application is. So what I'm going to do in the rest of the talk is try to trace the evolution of data-driven applications since their infancy to today, right? And so we look at it seems to me that there have been 4 kind of generations of data-driven applications, and as we go along, we'll sort of use this analogy of oil and oxygen, and you'll see where it comes up. And then, if we have time, after we talk about the 4 generations, I'll talk about the new world that we're living in, which is a data-rich world, and talk about how to succeed in a data-rich world, which might be something helpful to you guys as you enter a data-rich world, which is very different from the data-poor world that we live in recently. And something about the next revolution. That's kind of an overview. So let's talk about the first generation of data-driven apps, right? This was back, I'd say, in the late 80s and early 90s, when I was doing undergrad here. That's kind of when we had perhaps the first generation of data-driven applications. And if you think about what the data was in those days, the data was primarily structured data that lived inside big companies, right? So big companies had big data sets, had data sets about things like sales, about inventory, about payroll, about customers and things like this, right? So they had databases about these things, the kind of things that you would learn in an intro database systems class or something like that. So that's the kind of databases that existed back in the late 80s and early 90s, and companies use these data to essentially run their business operations. Right? You need a database of payroll to pay your people, to pay your employees. You need a database of inventory to know how much, whether you had all the supplies on hand and so on. So this data was sort of a part of running, part of business process automation, part of running the company kind of thing, right? So that's what the data was used for. But then some forward-thinking companies realized that you could use this data for far more than operational reasons. You could do interesting things with it to improve the efficiency of the business that go beyond just running the company or doing inventory or doing payroll. And you saw early use cases of using data to do interesting things. Right? A classic example of this kind of thing, if you're familiar with this, is called market basket analysis. So for example, so the market basket analysis is something like this, right? Let's say you go to a store, like a grocery store, and you buy various items, right? You buy a basket of items. Maybe you buy soap, and maybe you buy, maybe you buy some cereal, and maybe you buy some milk or something like that, right? What the store, at the store, the cash register of the store is recording the transaction of all the items that you're buying as in the receipt, right? So, and this is what's called a market basket. Market basket analysis consists of taking this data and then trying to figure out what are the items that are purchased together, right? This is also called
called association rule mining. So for example, you might find out that milk and bread are bought very often together, right? And if, let's say, a supermarket finds out that people buy milk and bread together very often, right? Then they can use that information to do interesting things. They can, for instance, they could run a promotion on bread and say, today bread is 50% off. But they'll increase the price on the milk, right, to try to make up the margins to get. So that's how you sort of run promotions. Or you might find that chips and ketchup are bought together, right? In which case you'll put them really far apart in the store so that people see other items before they pick up the chips and the ketchup. So this is what market basket analysis is used for, it's very interestingly one of the earliest and apocryphal examples, perhaps, of market basket analysis was people figured out somehow that the two items that were purchased quite frequently together were beer and diapers, right? Beer and diapers were bought very often together. Can anyone guess why people would buy beer and diapers together? This is in the US, right? So this is in the late 80s, early 90s, beer and diapers. So it turns out that diapers means there's a baby in the house, and if there's a baby in the house, you can't go to a bar to drink, so you buy beer to take it home with you, right? So that was kind of the reason why people used to buy beer and diapers together. And this is one of the early kind of surprising insights that came from market basket analysis. So there are lots of examples of these data-driven apps. So primarily these data-driven apps used data that was internal to the company, did some kind of analysis on this, and the company was able to act on that insight to generate profit in some interesting way, right? So one of the most common, I wanted to use an example of a first generation application that you're all familiar with, the most popular one that I assume that most of you are familiar with is it's about recommendation systems, right? So many of you have shopped at e-commerce sites, whether it's at Amazon or Flipkart or any of these sites, and one of the interesting things they do is that they recommend to you books or other products based on the past products that you purchased, right? So that's a very classic example of a first generation data-driven application, because it's using data that's kind of very internal to the to the company, that's being generated by a business process to improve the operation by sort of making recommendations, and increasing sales, right? So somehow Amazon figured out that I'd like these books based on other books that I bought in the past, right? So this is an example that I think you'll all be familiar with of a first generation application. This was kind of built in the early 90s, right? In the I'd say 1994, 95, around the time that I was at Amazon was when we first came out with this, and it turned out to be hugely popular, and it's sort of used in a lot of other places. Now. It's called collaborative filtering. Is the technical name that's given to this kind of algorithm. How many of you are familiar with these recommendations and have used them in the past? Okay, most of you. So you understand this example. And the reason why, if you think about the data that's used here, right, that Amazon makes these recommendations, the only company that has access to the information is Amazon, right? The data is kind of private to Amazon, and Amazon is using it to improve the business process. So in a way, you can think of this data as like oil, right? You have a valuable resource. It's kind of in a raw form, but if you refine it and you extract it, you can get a lot of value from it. So the data is in a way like oil. And that's why a lot of people today, if you hear, if you sort of follow the chatter, and then a lot of people say data is a new oil, because if you can take the data and refine it, you can kind of get a lot of business value from it. So the second generation, right? I mean, as as the 90s wore on and the internet became more popular, you sort of started getting data about the World Wide Web, and you started getting sources of information like Wikipedia that are freely open and available to everyone. And this data is what I'll call public data. The data is kind of you can access the data as well as anybody else. You can crawl and index and do anything you want with this data. It's openly available to you. It's unlike like the payroll system of a company or Amazon's purchase information, which is only available to that company. The data on the web or on Wikipedia is freely available to all of us, right? So this is what I'll call public data. And the second generation of data-driven apps was all about so realizing that there's this huge amount of public data available. It's in the mid-90s. And then using this public data to do interesting things with it. Okay. So what's the biggest, most interesting example of an app that uses public data that you can think of? Anyone? You've all used it. Google, right? So search. Search is the most popular and biggest, the best example that anybody can think of harnessing the power of public data, right? Google didn't create the data. Google's just helping you find data better, the data that's, use the data better, the data that's there publicly available to everyone. You build an app on top of it that allows you to search it better, right? So so what Google's doing is harnessing the power of public data, right? So this is a second generation app that uses not private data but public data. So Google doesn't own the data, but it makes it more useful for all of us, right? So so in this case, data is not like oil, but it's like oxygen, right? So it's just freely available, and you can use it to do interesting things. You don't have to pay for it, unlike oil, right? It's oxygen. Okay. So that's an example of a second generation app. Now move on to third generation. This is as we go into the now we are moving into the first decade of the new century, and in the around 2004 2005-ish time frame, all these social networks became available, right? So for Facebook, Foursquare, Twitter, and so on. So all kinds of social networks, and also mobile. So with social and mobile, you get a third kind of data, right? Let's look at status updates on Facebook or on Twitter or tweets on Twitter and so on. These are not, strictly speaking, it's not public data, right? Your tweets on Twitter or your updates on Facebook are not public, right? But they're not private either, right? So you're sort of sharing them with other people in kind of a frictionless fashion, right? So this is what I'll call semi-public data, right? So this data is neither quite public nor quite private. It's semi-public data. It's shared in a frictionless manner, and with the user's consent, you can collect large amounts of social data in a fairly short amount of time. So the interesting application, data-driven apps of the third generation, which is in the mid-2000s, and still continuing today, are apps that use social and mobile data, that use this kind of semi-public data in interesting ways. So, lots and lots of examples that I'm sure many of you are familiar with. One of the most obvious examples is and then there's tons of this data, of course, hundreds of millions of tweets and Facebook updates and so on. So this data is probably the biggest data source today. And so a simple example is something like people you may know, right? Recommending friends based on other friends that you might have. I'm sure you're familiar with all these things. Another third generation example, and this is one that I was personally involved in building, is a product called TweetBeat. And what we were doing here was we were taking data, that public data, from Twitter actually, and we were using that to figure out what the most interesting events are that are going on. What are the events that people are talking about today? Sort of building a personalized newspaper based on Twitter, right? So this is an example of a third generation application that we built. This was built maybe 3 or 4 years ago. So this is an example that's 3 or 4 years old. So as an example of a third generation data-driven app that uses semi-public data. Right? Moving on to the fourth generation, right? Where all the action is today, right? And this is just the beginning of the fourth generation. Is in combining these different kinds of data into a single app, right? Can you combine public data or semi-public data with private data to build very new and interesting apps? For example, you could take the data that's on Wikipedia and combine the data that's in your payroll system or something like that, right? And do something interesting. You could take, for example, weather data and combine it with your sales data and find out, are people buying your product more on hot days, right? So things like this. So it's all about taking publicly available data and your own private data and doing interesting things with it. So an interesting analogy to think about is that the public data is kind of like oxygen, and the private data is like oil, right? And if you combine oil and oxygen, you get combustion, right? So that's kind of what's going on. There's an explosion of activity right now that's about combining oil and oxygen to create very, very interesting new apps. Right?